Welcome. I am Doug. I do represent a company, but I represent historic window restoration. And I'm glad that you guys are here to discuss restoration. We have a lot to talk about, but I believe that there's three types of people here. There's going to be cheerleaders, those that love restoration. There's going to be people here that are like, well, and I'm assuming that some of you may be considering investing in a historic home and not sure what to expect. And then maybe some of you jumped full board into owning a home and are trying to figure out what to do. So there's going to be something for all of you here. So jumping right into our presentation, and before I do that, let's look at this handout because I want to make sure that you understand what's in your hands. So I'm going to walk through this presentation. And by the way, this presentation will be available to you if we get your email in the back. I won't mark it. I'm not sending anything else other than this presentation and some links to some discounts that you can get because you were here this morning. But you can fill in the blanks as we walk through, but there's more to this handout than that. If you look at the second page, it may be hard to read. I tried to make it as big as I could without making it obnoxiously large on the page. But feel free to reference this as we talk through things. Because, for example, you see referenced on here in the middle there, it says Muntin. You also see referenced like a bottom rail, a blind stop, sash weight. I won't be talking through all this terminology, but hopefully as we go along, you'll better understand a double hung window. And not all of our historic windows are double hung, but this helps you begin to understand historic windows. And then, because again, I want to make this fun and engaging, I included a few cartoons, I included some references, some definitions, and then at the end, in the back, in case we don't get time, which I'm going to make sure there's plenty of time for question and answers. If you have questions for me in particular, there's my email address and even my personal cell phone number in the back above the answer key so that you can access, obviously you'll be able to access me at any point. So, without further ado, we're going to jump into why restore, and that's your first blank under workshop, fill in the blanks there. Why restore? Because I'm assuming that most of us, understand enough about restoration to want to be here, but not all of us are 100%, like I talked about earlier. Not all of us are necessarily a cheerleader or fully understand why it's important to restore. And part of it is the challenge of, and I'll specify two cultural challenges that we have. Culturally, the assumption is, like for example, when this becomes outmoded, because all of us have some level of cell phone, what do? Do we restore the phone? No, we replace the phone. Because obviously it doesn't make sense to restore a phone. At some point, if you can't download the software update because after 2 or 3 years, sometimes it feels like 6 months, you need a new phone. It's so frustrating. It's like they do it on purpose. Or, cars, for example. You don't necessarily, if it's an antique car, sometimes you restore it. But for example, I've got two old 2006 Honda CR-V and a 2008 Honda Fit sitting in my driveway that I need to replace because they're starting to really fall apart. So as Americans, culturally, we have this default, which makes sense in certain areas, but I'll talk about why it doesn't make sense in historic windows, to not replace, but restore. And the other thing, too, that becomes a kind of a knee-jerk reaction for us is, we already referenced the need to maintain historic windows, is for us Americans, we want things that are convenient. Time is a huge value for us, right? We all don't have enough time. So again, I appreciate you guys being here and spending the time to learn about restoration. And so if maintenance is that important to maintain your historic window for as long as possible, we want something convenient. And so that's why culturally, as Americans, it's not necessarily our first thought to restore. So, jumping into it, why restore? And so I'm going to start with number one, which is, and that's the blank under number one, authenticity. Authenticity. Okay. That may not be the first thing that comes to your mind about why restore. But when those historic homes that either you own or you see, especially we're in St. Augustine, there's a plethora of historic homes around here, were designed by architects. They designed it with something specific in mind for that home in terms of the space, the mass, the proportionality. Like if you look at some of these windows, and I'll show you a few pictures here, there is a uniqueness and a beauty, and the best word is an authenticity about these historic windows that you can't necessarily find in a replacement. And I don't want to say that modern homes aren't beautiful in their own way, but historic homes have a unique beauty that's brought by what was intended by the architect originally. I mean, you won't find that necessarily in a modern home. And those are wood, what's the word again? Good job. Making sure, I'm a teacher, making sure you guys remembered from our pop quiz. Muntins, beautiful muntins. And those are wood muntins forming that beautiful lattice work on that transom. Again, you got the mass, and then let me show you this one house in particular. And that's a house that you can find in Orlando. That's where we're based. And I'll be honest, I'm sure when I pulled that picture off, there was a little bit of Photoshop. But beyond the Photoshop, there's a beauty about that house that you will typically not find in a modern house. And like I was talking about before with the space in the wall and the mass and the beauty and the way the geometry and the proportionality and the lines are in the windows, it's beautiful. There is an authenticity to this house that was meant to look like this. So number 2, moving right along. Why restore? Number 1 is, good job. I want some. It's Saturday morning. Maybe you haven't had your coffee yet. I want to make sure that we're talking together. Number 2 is longevity. So I grew up in the Northeast, and I have taken multiple trips up to Boston. Beautiful, especially Boston in the fall. And when I have gone to Boston, it is amazing to me that you can go to the Paul Revere house and not just see replica windows of what was originally in that house when Paul Revere lived there. You can see the actual windows that Paul Revere looked through when he was living in it and when it was built in 1680. There's a longevity to historic windows that to me is impressive. And obviously it's critical, and I will harp on this, it's critical that they are maintained. But there's a longevity to historic windows, a crazy longevity. Anybody been to Mount Vernon? Beautiful windows. These are to me the most impressive ones. They're called Palladium windows. They're beautiful, but there's beautiful windows throughout that building. And again, maybe not quite as old as Paul Revere's house, but look when that was built. And those are not replacement windows. Those are the original windows that were built and installed back in 1758. There's a longevity. So, here's a question for you. And I'm going to be fair to the replacement window cousins, and this is interactive, what would you guess is the average lifespan of a replacement window? Anybody? 20? What'd you say? 6, okay. So, and it's a really hard number to come up with because there is a wide variety of replacement windows. But when you look at the warranties, when you look at how long they last, and assuming that they need to be replaced when they are falling apart, what we determined was it's about 15 to 20 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. The nicer, the more expensive ones could probably last a bit longer, and maybe the less expensive ones last a little, you have to replace them sooner. So, of course, the next question is, what do you think is the window lifespan of a historic wood window?
100. 300.
Yeah, obviously.
Well-maintained.
Well, exactly. A well-maintained wood window, I should emphasize. Yeah, well, and if you remember, for those that were here for the pop quiz, how old was that wood window in the oldest window in Great Britain? How old was that? Yep. And there it is. I don't know if that's the first ever window that was ever built. I'm sure there's other cultures where they have their own windows. I don't want to say that that was the first ever window, but that certainly is an old window. I'm not sure it's that impressive, but it's amazing that it lasted that long. All right, so we're cooking. We're walking through this real quick, right? So number one, why restore is what? Good job. Number two is longevity. Number three is efficiency. And maybe this is the reason why you're here, because some of you, if you own historic windows, the question is, come on, they can't, there's no way that they're efficient at all. And so I assume that when you walked in here, you have some adjectives that you would associate with old windows, right? What are those adjectives? Beautiful's good, but if we're being negative about old windows, what are they? Yeah, Ron, yep. Yep, 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 and yep. Especially, and I'm talking about old windows that are not well maintained. Drafty, leaky, energy hogs, noisy, they rattle, too hot, too cold, right? That is the knock. Well, I'm here to tell you that historic windows, with a little help, can actually be more energy efficient than their replacement window cousins. And there's tests to prove it. Okay, there's tests to prove it. And in terms of energy efficiency, I'm going to try to expand your mind a little bit. They are actually not as energy inefficient as you think. So we're going to start with that latter one. And I know that you didn't come here for a lot of math and science, but in order to prove that they can be energy efficient, we need to get into some of the math and science. So let's turn to the next page if you're not already there on your handout. And there's some helpful definitions. I'm assuming that you're literate and you can read. So what I'm going to do is illustrate those definitions instead of reading that for you. Embodied versus operational carbon. Let me define those for you in an illustration. And I'm going to use a lot of car illustrations, which may sound weird because my wife would tell you, anybody would tell you, I'm not a car guy, but it makes sense because we all drive cars, we understand cars. So operational carbon is what was emitted from your car when you came here. Because I'm assuming very few of us walked, we all drove. So you emitted operational carbon. But to build that car, that used embodied carbon. So that's the difference, to manufacture something. So, and this is what I'm trying to get to in terms of why historic windows are actually more energy efficient than replacement windows in this sense. Because a lot of us think strictly about, well, you're losing this AC through your windows. And yet, if you're comparing it to your replacement window cousins, they had to be built. And so because of that manufacturing process, that required embodied carbon. Let's go to this quote, because this should make a little more sense based on what we just discussed. Can anybody read that for me? Because I'm tired of hearing myself already.
Replacing single-pane glass to reduce operational carbon emissions also means glass with a 1,000-year lifetime is replaced by an IGU with a 25 to 30-year lifetime. Increased embodied carbon has also been traded for reduced operational carbon emissions.
Thank you. Well done. So maybe I hope that makes a little more sense based on what I just explained, the embodied versus operational carbon. Because again, I want to help us understand. And I'm here not to say that you have to restore, or restoration is the only thing. I'm here to present facts and figures, math and science, for why it makes sense to restore. Now, we're going to get into the math piece. So there is a code, it's called the International Energy Conservation Code, that all windows have to meet. The most recent code I have is the 2021, And it says, window skylights, sliding glass doors shall have an air infiltration rate of not greater than 0.3 cubic feet per meter per square foot. So again, we're getting into some math. I know it's Saturday morning, so I appreciate your patience with this. And there were tests done on historic windows to see how they did. And again, they can beat these codes with a little help, but they can beat these codes. And so, and obviously energy efficiency is a broad concept that includes air infiltration and includes heat and light. So to address the air infiltration piece, this was the test that was done. The control is a single pane unrestored wood window, which didn't do terribly well, as you can see. But when you add, when you restore it, and I have an example of a restored wood window here. One side's restored, one isn't. You can see that if you add an exterior wood storm window, as such, no weather stripping, you beat the code. Window number 2, if it's restored, you add some weather stripping and a rubber gasket type of weather stripping, suddenly you're blowing it away. And and on and on. Adding an integrated metal weather stripping and adding an exterior metal storm product. Finally, window 4 would be, it's restored. Again, all of them being restored. You're adding just rubber bulb weather stripping, and you're at 0.04. So that's window number 4. And then finally, not restored, but you're adding an interior air panel. And that would be this interior Indo is the product that we sell. But again, it needs a little bit of help, but I don't want you guys to walk away thinking that a historic window is not energy efficient. It can be. Even a restored historic window can be incredibly energy efficient. So that's air infiltration. Now, walking into the heat side of things. So when we're talking about heat and light, it really is climate-based. And obviously, if you've ever been to Hibbing, Minnesota, or you've ever been to Bangor, Maine, or somewhere up north, it's going to look different up there in terms of energy efficiency with the heat and the light versus in Miami or St. Augustine, right? And so currently, it's kind of funny that I may have hit the wrong button. All right. It's almost like the number 2 is almost aimed right at St. Augustine. But we're obviously in zone 2. And so based on this slide, I know I'm throwing a lot of science at you early in the morning. But all you need to pay attention to is climate 2. Fenestration, that word basically means window. And we're assuming operability. So we're looking at 0.65 is our number. And let me talk about these tests, because I want to make sure that we understand specifically what we're talking about on the heat and the light. So if you go back to your handout, and by the way, I don't know if you've ever seen this window before, but the window in this picture, does anybody know what that is? Just kind of as an aside. I don't know that it necessarily is important other than maybe if you're ever on Jeopardy.
Is it an escape window?
No, it's not. It's actually a unique feature of homes up in Vermont. It's what's called a witch's window. You'll find that in certain parts of New England, especially Vermont. And the myth was that witches couldn't get through it somehow because of it being off-angle. Some people also thought that maybe that was a way that they could get coffins in and out of the second floor. I don't know if that's true or not. You can look it up on Google, but yeah, witch's window. It's a unique part of architecture up in Vermont. See, you learned something today. All right, so just below that picture on your handout, there are helpful definitions. One of them in bold, it says U factor, and that's what we're about to talk about. And that specifically speaks to insulation. And it specifically speaks to the heat transfer, non-solar related, not directly sun coming in, but the heat outside versus the AC inside, at least in Florida, right? And so let's look at, we'll skip. And we'll talk about SHGC, solar heat gain coefficient, in just a minute. But here is the tests that were done, again, these are real tests that were done on historic windows in this U factor area. And why this is also important is because a lot of modern window companies, when they sell you a replacement window, they will throw these things at you. This is the U factor. It's really cool. It's amazing. And it's good for you to know this because your historic window won't necessarily have a U factor code on it, right? But the replacement window will. And yet they've been tested, and this is what they came up with. Again, the single pane unrestored wood window didn't necessarily do the best. That's understandable. But with a little help, window 1 is actually a replica historic window that's built by a company out in Dallas. That actually did relatively well. Did just above the code. So this line is the code, and as we looked at previously, that's 0.65. And then window number 2, with this Indo again, we're at 0.55. So we have already beaten the code. And then with an exterior wood storm, we're even doing better. We're at 0.49. And then we'll talk about this type of glass in a second, if I can get this up. With the Pilkington Spacia, it does really well at 0.18. So again, with a little help, and with it being restored, a historic wood window can be incredibly energy efficient. And I also just referenced solar heat gain coefficient. The helpful definition of that is it's measuring essentially the sun's heat through the window as you look at your definitions at the bottom of, I believe it's page 3 on your handout. So this is how a historic window did. And again, because we're talking about sun and the direct heat from the sun, it obviously is relative depending on the orientation, because if you're on the north side of your house, it's going to feel a little different than if you're on the south side of your house, right? East and west, obviously depending on what time of day. And so relative to this, it's more about the films that you can put on your windows, as well as there's a solar screen, which I don't have a copy of, but again, I can get you guys links if you guys are interested in any of this. But again, my point is, I don't want to necessarily get into the minutia of it, but the point is that any historic wood window, with a little help, can be incredibly energy efficient. And this is just an example of what this, it's not a cheap glass, but because it's so thin, it can fit easily in a historic wood window profile, a spaceship. And I don't know if you're familiar with low E glass, but that's a type of coating that you can put on that rejects UV rays. And so it helps, again, with the energy efficiency. And I'm going to skip over some of this. And so wrapping up energy efficiency in this part of why we restore, I think one thing that we don't sometimes acknowledge is the fact that there are passive ways that can help support our historic wood windows that have been done for decades. One of them being shutters, which sometimes can be appropriate for your architecture, and awnings, which because we've, in the last number of decades since AC was invented, it became standard in homes, we haven't relied on these as much as we used to. But I feel like we need to bring them back. I think as a passive way to help keep our homes energy efficient. What's wrong with shutters? What's wrong with awnings? I think they're important. All right, moving into affordability, because obviously for all of us, we need to think about our budgets and money and how that relates to everything we're talking about. And I don't want to leave behind what we just talked about with energy efficiency because, again, I think it's important to keep budgets in mind. And I want to be really specific when we're talking about budgets and especially return on investment. So this came from Energy Star, and there's some assumptions that have to be made with this. But when it comes to energy efficiency, I think sometimes we assume that we are going to save a ton of money when we replace our windows. I think that's the assumption that we make. And again, facts and figures. So if you look at this Energy Star chart and you look up Florida, you see that you can save, it's about $150 in Florida a year, which breaks out to, and so to break that out and to really get down into the math of it, again, I'm breaking out math Saturday morning, but we made assumptions that it's a 2,000 square foot home, that you've got approximately 20 windows at about 36 by 60 inches. And so your savings per window per year is about $7.50. And if you're assuming, we assumed, to be fair, that maybe it's about $650 per replacement window for 20 windows, then you're looking at, for your return on investment in terms of replacing all your windows with replacement windows, then you're looking at a return on about it'll take you about 87 years to get a return on investment, assuming that you replace those windows in order to get to be more energy efficient to save that money. So again, it's about the math. All right, here's a bigger chart, and there's a lot of facts and figures on this, but just to keep it simple, the question is, when you compare historic wood windows against not just replacement window as a category, but three categories: vinyl, new wood windows, and clad windows. Because sometimes it doesn't feel like sometimes it's easy to compare apples to apples. And so it's helping you compare apples to apples what you're getting. And so, for example, at the top, I wish I had a pointer. I should have brought a pointer. But at the very top, you have waste. Then you have labor, materials, and maintenance, because we're assuming that there's going to be some maintenance done. Even on replacement windows, you can maintain via just putting a little bit of caulk. But on historic wood windows, you can maintain by painting a little bit, touching up here or there, touching up the glazing. Then again, to be fair, there's energy savings. There's even some energy savings. We're assuming that you're adding a little bit to the historic wood window to give you some energy savings on the historic wood window. But still, the replacement windows all have a better energy savings, to be fair. And then, year after year, we're seeing progressively how do these dollar for dollar, how does it match up? And we're assuming that you're going to have to replace the windows after about 15, or I think we gave it 20 years, yep. And then you have to, assuming you're going to restore via a company who's going to service them, you're going to do that every about 40 years because the glazing only lasts so long, even when it's touched up and maintained. And so these are those final facts and figures as we determined, and these figures may be a little dated, a year or two old, but these give you an idea of dollar for dollar what you may be looking at in apples to apples comparison. All right, so we talked through a lot. Again, I'm trying to give you a fire hose of information because again, I appreciate your time. So now I'm gonna land in a place where I think many of you guys are here for this reason, and that's safety. And so again, I want to make this interactive. If you think about reasons why historic wood windows may not be safe, what comes to mind? Hurricanes, yes, especially we live on the coast in Florida. Yep, anything else that comes to mind? Fires, all right, yeah. Maybe egress? Temple glass. Yep. Anything else? Termites, all right. All right, what about lead paint? Because I would guarantee, maybe not the top layer, but I would guarantee the bottom layer or two have lead, right? And so that's not safe, right? So I don't want to overestimate the safety issue, because if you don't ever touch your windows, lead paint's not going to do you any harm. It's only when it becomes airborne that it does present a danger. And if you take that into account, it's not a huge deal. Obviously, we know about masks with COVID. So if you put the right mask on, if you protect yourself in the right way, if you're doing the restoration yourself, it really isn't a big deal. You just have to take the right precautions. Lead paint is only an issue, again, if it's airborne and you're taking it in. And there are tests, if you're doing the restoration yourself, there are tests that you can actually take to make sure that you're not ingesting a lot of lead. We, as a company, take that seriously, and we are EPA certified for lead containment. So whenever we go into someone's home, we take that very, very seriously. And as a potential DIYer, if that's what you do, make sure you think about that. And as long as you're thinking about that and taking the right precautions, it really isn't that big of a deal. Number two, it wasn't it was referenced with tempered glass, but I know that I've talked to some people who are concerned that because older windows have older wavy glass, that seems that may be more fragile. Typically, in the last 100 years, glass is glass. And unless we're talking about laminated glass, which is like a glass sandwich, two pieces of plastic with a piece of glass in the middle, most glass is going to, you throw a baseball bat, you throw a tree through it, any glass is going to break. Tempered glass is better because it breaks in a way that is safer, because it doesn't break out in all these small little shards. It breaks out in bigger chunks, so you're not going to be as hurt. But just to be fair to historic windows, glass is glass. And again, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about another safety concern relative to glass, but that is a concern, but I don't think that's as much a concern as some people give it. I just talked about this with somebody here, but asbestos on some windows, specifically steel casement windows, the glazing from about the 20s through the 40s, maybe 50s, there was asbestos that was put into that glazing putty. Most of your wood windows, you don't have to worry about it, but if you were ever concerned about asbestos, there's a company called Western Analytics out of California. You just send a small sample, and they will assess it and get you that a very complicated readout of what's in that sample, so you know. And again, you can take the right precautions. Security. Some people are concerned because a historic window just has a simple little sash lock. It has, it's got glass, it doesn't really have a lot to necessarily secure it, so any thief who's wanting to break into your house can very easily do so. Well, if a thief's going to break into your house, it really doesn't matter. If you've got glass, they're going to break in. They'll find a way. So I don't believe that historic windows are unusually safe as compared to any other window that's out there. You guys brought this up earlier. You may be here for this exact reason. There's another reason why people assume that historic windows can't be safe, and that's impact protection. Because a lot of the assumptions that many people make is I need to replace my historic windows. And let me break out 2 points on this because I want to make sure they're not confused. One reason that people assume that they need to replace their historic windows is just essentially safety. A hurricane a la Fort Myers last fall makes direct landfall in St. Augustine. It's going to be really hard for my windows to hold up, so I need to get better windows. The other question that a lot of people have, which is legitimate, is my homeowner's insurance is going to give me a tremendous discount if I get all my openings impact rated. And so I need to replace my windows, historic windows, to get that discount. Let me address both right now. Let me start with the safety one. So, number one, and let me skip right to, see if I can get this to, I love that wavy glass, love it. That's a beautiful house in Orlando with the wavy glass. So if you have wavy glass, then it's been there for how long? Correct. So again, risk management, let's not just make the assumption that there's going to be a storm next year. And so I want to say that straight off. It's beautiful, and so the question would be, how many hurricanes did that glass make it through? And if you look at your handout, I don't know if you guys are still referencing your handout, but if you look at the center of the page where safety concerns would be the fill-in at the top of that page, according to one stat, and again, I try to make sure you guys have all the facts and figures, 79 hurricanes/tropical storms have hit the Jacksonville area in the last 92 years. That's what I have recorded. Now, of course, those aren't direct hits. I mean, to be fair, it's not like it's not like a Hurricane Ian that just devastated the Fort Myers area. But to be fair, I don't know if you guys noticed this in the news, but they did highlight the fact that the historic homes in that area did better than the modern homes did in that area, because they brought them up and because it was better quality materials that were used. But also, to be fair, safety-wise, a lot of those windows any window, modern, replacement, historic window, struggled because of the tremendous storm that was coming through. But I want to say this about historic windows and safety before I get to talking about homeowners insurance and that question. We are this close to coming up with an impact-rated historic replica storm window. That once we get that we believe will be a game changer because you're set, at least in terms of your historic windows. We're this close. It's taken 5, maybe 6 years to go through the testing process to get it to that place. I know my boss was trying to have it at the very beginning of this hurricane season. We're not quite there yet, but we're really close. He thinks we'll be able to release it in June or July of this year. So if you're interested in that, we can get you information. But the point is that you don't have to give up your historic windows to get impact protection and that safety concern. Because I understand that in terms of safety. Regardless of where a hurricane hits, you want to be safe. You and your loved ones, you want to be safe. But more importantly than that, talking about homeowners insurance and the discount, I think a lot of us don't think about the fact that, well, number one, when they talk about impact protection, it's not just your windows, everything. So your garage door, your doors, all that needs to be protected. And so I believe that link still works. That's a QR code to see what your insurance savings would be. Again, you'll get this presentation at some point via email, I hope in the next week. But let me walk through the math. Again, this is about facts and figures. This is not just about what I think. So I actually just came up with these numbers. I reworked these numbers last night. And so obviously it depends on what your house is valued as to what your average, what your insurance costs. But let's say, and I looked up, what an average home / what the average homeowner's insurance would be. I don't know, but I was working again to the best of my ability with facts and figures. But assuming that your annual, and again, assuming that you could potentially get 70% savings on homeowners insurance if you replaced all your windows. And again, that means you also need to update your garage door and all doors with impact safety. So your annual savings could be, if you did all that, about $2,100 per year, and your savings after 5 years, that would be about $10,500. So, and again, I just looked these facts and figures up last night. So assuming that per window for a replacement impact window, we're looking at about $1,200, including installation. Then the cost of replacing 20 windows, because again, I'm going back to that sample house that was 2,000 square feet and 20 windows that were 3 by 5. We're looking at about $24,000, and then I estimated based on a little bit of research last night at 10 p.m., it could cost about $30,000 to do all that work. Then, again, going back to our return on your investment, if your replacement costs are $30,000 and your savings after 5 years is 10, then your total return on investment, you really wouldn't get a return on your investment for about 14 years. And that's assuming, again, that you've got 20 windows. Most historic homes have typically more than that. But my point isn't just the math, it's the alternatives. Because, and I don't know why this doesn't get more, this talk about just replacing windows they don't address the fact that there's other alternatives to getting that homeowner's discount. And according to our sources, because again, let's go back to the pop quiz. If you remember the pop quiz, what is the most important part of your house when it comes to potential damage to your stuff? You guys remember that question? Roof, right. And so ultimately the focus should, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be worried about the windows, but we should be more focused on the roof. And so what someone came up with is a hurricane clip that looks like that. And so if you install that clip on every part of your roof, attaching it to every part of your house, you get the same discount. that seems like that would be a less expensive option to get you the same benefit as replacing your historic windows. And there are other alternatives as well. But the point is that there are, keep pressing this button accidentally. The point is that there are ways, again, we want to make sure that you're saving money. But I'm assuming that you want to keep your historic windows. And so to do that, and again, it may not be easy for you to attach all these clips, but that is a way to do it. So let me skip through. All right, so we talked about why restore. We talked about a number of reasons. Do you remember what number one is? Again, I'm a teacher, so I want to make sure that we remember, because it's Saturday morning and maybe you haven't had your coffee yet. Number one is what? Good job. Number two is? Good job. 3, E. Yeah, we spent a little bit of time on that. And number 4 is? Affordability. Good job. And then we talked about what? Safety. Yes. And now we're really getting into the how. I've tried to fly through some of the why, because I think it's really important for us to get some of these questions answered. Yet, maybe we're here because we want to learn a little bit more about restoration. And in terms of the how, when we think of restoration, sometimes we think of it as you either restore or you don't. But there may be things that your windows need. And again, I'm not a car guy, but I'm gonna bring up car analogies, because maybe your car is just a little bit dirty and you just need a car wash, right? I mean, the point is, what do you need? And maybe it's that draftiness. Maybe it's an energy efficiency piece that you need. Maybe, like we talked about previously, maybe there's a little bit of rot. Maybe you're concerned because there's some rotten parts of your window, and so it doesn't necessarily need energy efficiency, but it needs rot repair. Bodywork is the analogy. Maybe your window just doesn't open, and for egress purposes, or maybe just because you want some nice cool air in December, maybe January, maybe not, depending on weather here. But you want the opportunity, the ability, the availability of cool air, and so bodywork. Or maybe for you, it's cosmetic. You really do want it to look nice. And so there's your car analogy for that. Or maybe it just needs some maintenance. And again, I'm getting back to that M word that I love. Because if we can do just a little bit of maintenance every year, like we need on our cars, typically, it goes a long way towards preserving your windows, historic windows, again, assuming you have them. All right, again, I don't know cars, and so I grabbed a picture. I don't even know what this car is, but it looks really nice. So maybe you guys can tell me. What car is that? It's a nice car, right? And that's what you have in your historic windows. And for that, to make the argument, so this is, and it's going to be hard to hold this, so there we go. So this is a 2019 2x4, same species, pine, I believe. 2019 2x4. This is a 1919 2x4. Now, just looking at it, you can probably notice some differences. But if you hold them, you can notice the difference even more. The value of your historic windows is beyond what most Americans think, because that old growth wood that is found behind the many layers of paint, including lead paint, it naturally resists rot. It naturally resists termite damage. There's all kinds of reasons to not throw out your windows. So I'll let you guys pass this around and feel the absolute difference. But my point is that it's not that we're talking about cell phones that just need to be understandably replaced. We're talking about quality wood. We're talking about quality craftsmanship. We're talking about a simplicity of balance system that almost seems too simplistic to some, but is very valuable. And I'm not anachronistic. I'm not saying we need to always keep all the old stuff. I think there is a value, though, to these windows. And so I think the problem is sometimes that we look at our windows and we don't see the previous car. My problem with my remote is sometimes I can't go back on the slide. We don't see that previous car we see that because we see peeling paint. To make the illustration, we see what's on the left side. We don't necessarily see what's on the right side, which may be hard to see that from where you're sitting in the back. But we see the issues. We don't see the value and the quality of like that. And so what sometimes we'll do is we'll replace that with that, which that's not a bad car. And I don't know if you have a Ford Focus. I don't want to demean anybody here with a Ford Focus. I've got a Honda Fit, so maybe it falls in that same category. But if you're replacing that previous vehicle with that, you're losing value, and that is my concern. And so getting into maintenance, and again, dollar for dollar, if you're looking at doing your own maintenance, and I don't know if it's $20 to $40 per year, but to do your own maintenance, it doesn't take a lot of time. And so I really want to harp on this. If you don't take anything away from this and you own a historic home, please promise me that you'll do this. And this doesn't have to be done every day. It doesn't have to be done every month. It doesn't have to be done more than maybe once or twice a year. But if you do this, if you go to your window, and typically it's not much more than a pinhole is what it starts as. And yeah, you would think a spot rot repair would take a professional. No, not when it's a pinhole. You can do it. I promise you. There's really good YouTube clips. You can take care of it. You don't need professionals to restore your own window because it's a small spot. Glazing putty touch-up. And you can even buy our books if you need help or other resources, but our goal would be that you can keep your historic wood windows and not have to spend a lot because they're beautiful and they're worth keeping. Lubricate the mechanicals, clean the glass, touch up the paint. It doesn't take a lot to do that. So now I'm going to really get into the practice. Thank you. That's better. There I am. Thank you. So now we're getting a little bit into your diagram. I believe it's page 2. Just wanted to quickly walk through a double hung window. Not all historic windows are double hung. Some are casements that open like this. Not all are wood. Some are steel. And more we're seeing some historic windows actually aluminum windows fall into that category because what makes it historic is typically its age, and aluminum windows now are 50 years old or older. So, a jamb, so let's go back to going back to my diagram. So, a jamb is essentially the casing that the sash sit in. And I don't know how well it's labeled here. They call it a side jamb, a head jamb, and then the stool is the interior sill. So again, we're talking through some of these diagram elements, and there's stops that all go into that jamb part to make up the framework for the sash to sit in. Then the sash are the operable element. Typically in a double hung, it's operable 2 elements. Sometimes you can have a triple hung. There are bigger windows. In fact, there are some that are big enough that you can actually walk through. It's like a weird double hung walk-through window. It's really cool. And then the mechanicals are, and I've got some samples up here, are obviously typically it's your sash lock. It's your lift to get the sash up and down. And then this is an example of a scallop pulley that goes on either side. And back in the day, the reason they're called double hung windows because both sash operate. Because back in the day, when many of these homes were built in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, they didn't have AC. And so in order to get that beautiful flow of air, they would drop the top sash, they would raise the bottom sash, and had this amazing circulation of air going in and out. And then you have the casing and the trim, obviously, that goes around the window. All right, so as we wrap up, obviously the questions are, if you're looking at window restoration, what are your options? And our goal is obviously to help you make this as inexpensive as we can. Meaning, if you can do it yourself, we've got tools. We actually have a whole department in our company associated with selling different products, different tools, in fact, we sell the sash rope, Here's a sample of a whole bundle. We sell you saw Scott demonstrate the pointer. This is actually called a pro scraper that we use to scrape the flats. And then we have other tools here as well. This was the sash saw that he mentioned that he would have used in the video if they had had that at that point, as well as a stripper and some other items here to help you do the restoration. But we know it's hard work. So again, do it yourself, do it together. Maybe there's options that you do. Maybe you help work with us. We do have currently a DIY option where if you're interested, you can pay to talk to somebody from our company when you get to a point where you have some challenges. We all know historic homes, historic windows, you never know what you're going to run into, and so there's always going to be questions. Or potentially, a company like ourselves could do it. There are other people that can do it as well. It's not just about our company. This is a little bit about who we are. We do restoration, we do replication, doors, screens, shutters, storms. But this is the stuff that we offer for free. We do have free tutorials, like I said, tools and materials. You saw 4 videos from that, the windowcourse.com classes. And what I love about what Scott offers is once a week he puts out blog postings that is everything and anything associated with not just windows or doors, but anything associated with historic homes. And so our goal is to come alongside of you and see how we can help in whatever way possible. Here's some references, and that's all she wrote. So thank you for being here.
It's great to have this many people interested in historic wood windows, because sometimes we feel like we are trying to advocate for keeping those, and we don't feel like we have a lot of interested people. So it's nice to see all of you on a Saturday taking your time to learn more about it. So as Doug said, there are possibilities of us offering a hands-on workshop. I think we've done that in the past, and we haven't had a lot of attendees, but if you're interested, if you could how many would want to come to a hands-on workshop?
You can all come to my house.
I hear you. I have done that. I have done window restoration with my husband in an old Italianate house, so I understand how it is a labor of love, but you just cannot have that same look with a replacement window. So we were so glad that we took the time to do that. So I was going to just show you a few slides because we kind of started right into the workshop. The beautiful building that we're in now, I just wanted to kind of go through really quickly a little bit of the history. Make sure you take one of those self-guided tour handouts, and that will tell you a lot about it. We'll just scroll through real quick. It was constructed in 1898. It was completed that year. It was the city's first utility pumping station, and then it had a pretty short life. And you can see that was an addition that is not here anymore. That held the water. There was an intake well, the engine room and boiler room, in these kind of areas that are no longer here. And it's an unusual building because it is brick, and in the city we don't see a lot of brick buildings. Next slide. And it had the artesian well and aerating basin, and you can still see that on the back. And there's kind of a rounded cement curbing where that was, and you can kind of see the remnants of that. And we can also see it, it's interesting on the Sanborn maps when we look and do research for architecture, that we could see the waterworks building on the 1899 through the 1924 maps. These are just images that shows the building's footprint. And you can kind of see how it evolved through the years. And then it became Davenport Park when the city decided that this was a kind of an obsolete space for doing the work of a waterworks. They built a new one, which is on King Street. And then they turned this area into Davenport Park. And in 1928, Hollingsworth, an architect, he was ahead of his time. We talk about adaptive use of historic buildings. So they were already in the 20s adaptively using historic buildings, and this is what happened to this building. It became a community center, basically. And so they took this building, kind of took out the mechanical equipment and all the different things that were needed for a waterworks and turned it into this community space. And they built an outdoor stage, and that was reconstructed with a rehabilitation that was recently done. So these are slides from the kind of, probably I forget, I think it was like 1940 or 1930s. It was used by many different civic organizations, including, it was a little theater, the Art Association used it, the Campfire Girls, and the Garden Club all used it at one point. And you can see, it's kind of cool to see it today because there's actually a production that's happening this weekend. So you can see how the stage is used right now, just kind of like it was circa 1957. In the 70s, the lovely 70s, when they did all kinds of things to our historic buildings, they added kind of that inappropriate addition to the left. And so that was on that upper circled area. The circled area on the bottom is an octagonal projection that at times was used in different ways. There was, when it was Davenport Park at first, they actually had public restrooms and there was an exterior entrance to that. So it was closed around 2005 after they realized the building was kind of getting in poor condition. They had to actually install interior scaffolding in 2009. They listed it as a National Register of Historic Places building in 2013-14 and made it a local landmark. They also, city staff worked hard and obtained some grants through the Department of Historic Resources. And between 2015 and 17 especially, there was kind of a big push to do the rehabilitation. And you can kind of see there's a lot of people involved throughout the years analyzing and coming up with a rehabilitation plan. So this, you can see this interior scaffolding in this room. They actually had to do that to keep the roof from collapsing. And here are some of the efforts that you can see. I mean, they had to take, some of the brick was so deteriorated and the masonry, they had to kind of rebuild some of the exterior walls. So it's a pretty dramatic rehabilitation project. And the roof. There had to be, sometimes the interior walls, I think, had to be shorn up. And there was, all of these brick walls on the interior were coated with just many layers of paint, as you can imagine. So they also decided to take off that awful 70s addition, and they actually kept that octagonal projection, and that's in the back, is now being used as a storage room. But they added, I think the next slide shows, and that's that projection from the outside. And we encourage you to walk around the building if you have the time before you leave, because there's the stage that they rebuilt. And then they actually did add an addition, a modern addition, and that houses the restrooms that we all enjoy today. So, you know, if you do things sensitively, it does not ruin a historic building. And that's from the outside when you look at it from San Marco Avenue. And I just kind of projected the floors. They had done some research because I think they were covered with many layers. And they actually realized they were terrazzo floors, but it was, they weren't in good condition and it would be very costly. I mean, terrazzo is a wonderful material, but very expensive. They last forever, but, so they did coquina concrete and they sealed it. So So it kind of has that same look as terrazzo. And just kind of to think about all the paint that they had to remove from these brick walls was a labor of love. And so today, starting in 2022, the St. John's Cultural Council became the new tenant and breathed new life into this building. And they are just a wonderful organization. We work closely with them. The city still owns the building, but they lease the space and they use it almost every day, or I mean, every week for sure. You should subscribe to their newsletter if you haven't already, because I just am amazed how many programs they hold throughout the month. And the stage, I just wanted you to have a chance to see the stage when it's not set. They, use the concrete tile floors on that. And just yesterday, or 2 days ago, our historic marker sign from the state, we applied for that, and it was accepted in August. We had to have it reviewed by a state board, the state marker committee. And they carefully go line by line at every word you write and kind of make sure that they think it's correctly phrased. And it took forever to, how everything is taking forever to get nowadays. We were supposed to get it in a few months after August, but we just got it at the beginning of May, so it was installed this week. And so it is right outside of the Davenport gate on San Marco Avenue. So we really appreciate it. I'm Julie. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Julie Courtney, Historic Preservation Officer for the City of St. Augustine. So thank you very much.